The year is 1948. The war hasn't reached its worst chapter yet. But in a stretch of jungle northwest of Saigon, something unusual is already happening. A group of men are digging, not to build a house, not to plant crops. They are digging to disappear. The ground they're working is red clay, thick, dense, the kind that holds its shape when you cut into it. They dig down, then sideways. Down again. The passages are narrow, deliberately narrow, barely wide enough for a single person to squeeze through. They carve small chambers into the walls. They pack the loose earth back around the entrance, smooth it over, cover it with leaves. Then they walk away. From above you would see nothing, just jungle floor. That hole in the ground, that almost invisible entrance, was the beginning of what would become one of the most remarkable underground systems ever built by human hands. Over the next 20 years, as the conflict in Vietnam grew into a full-scale war involving the most powerful military force on Earth, those first simple tunnels expanded, deeper, wider, more complex, until they stretched across more than 250 kilometers beneath the Cu Chi district, running 3 levels deep, housing entire communities of people who had chosen to live beneath the surface rather than abandon their land. By the early 1960s, the tunnel network had become an underground city. There were rooms for sleeping, rooms for cooking, storage spaces, meeting rooms, medical clinics, schools, wells that tapped into underground water sources, kitchens designed so that smoke traveled horizontally through long underground passages and dissolved into the jungle air before it could be spotted from above. Ventilation shafts disguised as termite mounds, dotting the forest floor, invisible to soldiers and aircraft passing directly overhead. Thousands of people lived down there, not just fighters, farmers, teachers, doctors, grandparents, children. People whose daily lives had moved entirely underground, who ate their meals underground, slept underground, worked and argued, and fell in love and raised children underground. Away from sunlight, away from open air, below the roots of the trees, below the reach of everything above. The entrance holes were engineered with a specific purpose in mind. They were made to be impassable for the average American soldier. The men and women who built these tunnels were smaller in frame, and they designed the passages around their own bodies. A soldier from outside Vietnam, even one who found an entrance, often simply could not fit through it. And even the entrances that could theoretically be located were protected by a second layer of defense that sounds almost too clever to be real. Certain herbs and leaves were burned near the trapdoors. Specific plant materials were rubbed into the wood and the surrounding soil. The result was a scent profile that military tracker dogs, trained, experienced animals that had performed reliably in dozens of other environments, could not process correctly. The dogs would approach an entrance, pause, sniff, then move on. The smell of the tunnels had been masked so precisely that one of the most reliable tracking technologies available simply stopped working. The tunnels didn't just hide people. They hid the fact that people were there at all. For those who descended for the first time, who climbed down through a trap door and pulled it shut above them, there was one sensation that appears in every account, from every person, on every side of the conflict who ever entered the Cu Chi system. The silence. Not the quiet of a room at night, not the muffled silence of a basement, something more total. The moment the trapdoor closed, the sounds of the world above, wind, birds, engines, voices, simply stopped, replaced by a pressure, a weight in the ears, the feeling of the earth around you as something present, something physical, something that was neither hostile nor welcoming, but simply vast and completely indifferent. The air was thin, the walls were close, the darkness for anyone without a lamp was absolute, and somewhere in that darkness, 10,000 people were going about their lives. The tunnels ran on 3 levels. Each level had a different purpose, and the logic behind the design tells you a great deal about who built it and how they thought about survival. The first level was the shallowest, roughly 2 to 3 meters below the surface. This was the level of movement, quick access to the surface, short passages connecting trapdoors and hidden exits. If something happened above ground, if a patrol came through or a strike hit nearby, fighters on the first level could surface within seconds and be back in the jungle. Or, if the surface became too dangerous, they could drop to the second level and seal the passage behind them. The second level sat 4 to 8 meters down. This was the living level. Along the walls of wider passages, chambers had been carved into the clay. Small rooms, barely large enough for a person to lie flat. Storage areas, a communal space where people could sit together. This level is where daily life happened. Meals, rest, conversation, the ordinary routines that people maintained, even in the most extraordinary circumstances. The third level went down to 10 meters or more. This was the level of last resort. When bombers came, and they came constantly, in waves, day and night, the third level held. The red clay of the Cu Chi district had specific physical properties that made it unusually resistant to blast force. Its density and moisture content allowed it to absorb and redistribute shock waves rather than transmitting them downward. People on the third level during a bombing run felt the earth move, a nauseating, rolling vibration that had no single source, but the structure around them held. The 3 levels were connected by tight passages with deliberate bottlenecks. In some sections, the only way to move between levels was a passage barely wide enough for a body to pass through, oriented at a steep angle, with turns that required a person to essentially fold themselves around corners. These were not design flaws, they were security features. An enemy entering the tunnel system from above could not move quickly through these transitions. Anyone defending from below had a significant advantage at every one of these points. Now, one of the most ingenious problems the tunnel builders had to solve was cooking. People need to eat. Cooking requires fire. Fire produces smoke. And in a heavily surveilled jungle, a column of smoke rising from the trees could end the entire operation in minutes. The solution was developed by a fighter named Huang Kum, and it bears his name to this day. The Huang Kum kitchen worked by routing smoke not upward, but horizontally, through a series of long underground passages that spread the smoke thin across a wide area before it reached the surface. By the time any smoke emerged, it had diffused so completely that it was invisible from the air. Entire communities cooked hot meals underground, every day, without ever producing a visible smoke signature. The water supply was solved by what amounted to geological luck, though the people who found it clearly knew how to look. Deep in the tunnel system, workers digging for water encountered underground sources, natural channels in the rock and clay beneath the red surface soil. Wells were dug into these sources and incorporated into the second and third levels. In the middle of some of the most intensively bombed territory on Earth, there was clean water available underground. The people living in the tunnels had access to it year-round. The ventilation system was the most visually clever piece of the whole design. Fresh air is not optional. Thousands of people in an enclosed underground space would exhaust available oxygen within hours without regular air exchange. The tunnels needed vents. But vents are detectable. They break the surface. They create visible points of entry. The designers solved this by building their vents to look exactly like termite mounds. Rounded clay structures, irregular in shape, aged-looking, scattered across the jungle floor in the patterns that termite colonies actually create. Soldiers walked past them. Aircraft photographed them. Nobody paid them any attention. The termite mounds breathed. There were also weapons workshops embedded in the second level. This is one of the details that military historians return to most often, because it speaks to a particular kind of resourcefulness that is very difficult to plan for. American bombs that fell in the Cu Chi area had a significant failure rate. A meaningful percentage did not detonate on impact. The people in the tunnels collected these unexploded shells, carefully, methodically, at significant personal risk. They brought them underground. They disassembled them. They extracted the explosive material and the metal components, and they fabricated their own weapons from the materials that had been sent to destroy them. The bombs dropped on Cu Chi were, in part, being recycled into the defense of Cu Chi. American soldiers who served in Vietnam had a phrase they used when they talked about the jungle. They said the jungle was never empty, even when you couldn't see anything, even when the trees were still and the air was quiet and there was no movement anywhere around you. Even then, you were not alone. In the Cu Chi district, that feeling was not paranoia. It was an accurate reading of the situation. The people who maintained the tunnel network understood their position precisely. In a direct confrontation on open ground, they could not match the firepower and technology available to American forces. Their advantages were different. They knew the terrain with the intimacy of people who had grown up on it, farmed it, buried their relatives in it. They understood the rhythm of the jungle, which paths flooding would close, which clearings would be in shadow at which hours, which parts of the ground would hold weight and which would not. And they had time to prepare the environment before anyone else arrived. What they built across the surface above the tunnels and along the approaches to the tunnel entrances was a layered system of concealed hazards. Not the static minefield of conventional warfare, which can be detected and marked and avoided. Something more intimate, more responsive, designed not just to stop movement, but to make movement through this territory a continuous, exhausting, psychologically draining experience for anyone who hadn't spent their life here. The most well-documented of these were the Punji stake pits, a shallow pit dug alongside a natural path covered with a frame of thin bamboo and leaves that would hold the weight of dead leaves settling on it, but not the weight of a person stepping on it. Inside the pit, sharpened bamboo stakes. The construction itself was straightforward, but what made these particular traps so significant in military medical records was what the stakes were treated with: natural materials that introduced severe infection into any wound. A soldier who encountered one of these traps wasn't just injured. They were removed from service for weeks, sometimes permanently, by an infection that field medicine in the jungle could not easily control. The tunnel entrances had their own protective systems. Some passages branched at junctions in the dark. One branch led forward. One branch ended in something that wouldn't be visible until it was too late. In total darkness, moving by touch, the difference between the two was invisible. There was no way to know which direction was safe without information that only someone who had been trained on this specific section of tunnel would have. In certain passages, defenders had positioned venomous snakes, not trained, not controlled, simply placed in sections of tunnel where they would naturally coil in the warmth and weight. In the pitch black, a person reaching forward into a space had no warning. The accounts from American soldiers who searched these tunnels describe, repeatedly, the specific fear of reaching a hand into darkness and not knowing what it would touch. Scorpions were kept in sealed containers that could be opened quickly into a tunnel section if an intruder was approaching. Biting ants were cultivated near certain entrance points. What emerges from all of this is a portrait of an environment that had been deliberately, methodically, and with considerable patience turned into a place that the people who built it could navigate safely, and everyone else could not. The jungle above was not neutral. The ground beneath it was not neutral. The darkness in the tunnels was not neutral. Every element of the environment had been considered and, where possible, incorporated into the defense. The psychological effect on the soldiers ordered to search these tunnels was distinct from the effect of conventional combat. In an open firefight, the stress is acute and directional. You know where the threat is, or approximately where it is. Your training gives you responses. Your body has a target for its adrenaline. In the tunnels, the threat was everywhere and nowhere. It was in the floor, the walls, the air. It was behind you and ahead of you simultaneously. There was no direction that was safe, no movement that could be made with confidence. The training that prepared soldiers for open combat did almost nothing to prepare them for this. The men sent into the Cu Chi tunnels came out changed. We will talk about them in detail shortly. But first, we need to spend time with the people who were already inside, not as soldiers, but as a community, as families, as human beings trying to hold something of ordinary life together in conditions that should have made that impossible. At its peak, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 people lived in the Cu Chi tunnel system. Not just fighters moving through, permanent residents. People who had moved their entire lives underground and stayed there, for months, for years. The diet was built almost entirely around cassava, a starchy root vegetable, boiled or dried and ground into rough flour, with salt. Occasionally rice, when supply lines could reach the deeper parts of the network. Occasionally something foraged from the surface during brief nighttime excursions. But the staple, day after day, was cassava and salt. Enough calories to survive, not enough to feel well. The children who grew up in the tunnels were visibly smaller than their peers in unaffected areas. A measurable physical consequence of years of nutritional deficit during critical growth periods. The medical facilities were real. There were actual doctors in the tunnels, men and women who had been trained before the war and had chosen to come underground with their communities. They had instruments, they performed surgery, but they worked by the light of oil lamps, small flames burning in enclosed spaces that consumed the already thin air, and they worked with supplies that were never sufficient. Anesthesia was scarce. Antibiotics were scarce. When supplies ran out, procedures continued anyway because there was no alternative. Patients who needed surgery got surgery. They held still not because they were sedated, but because they understood that holding still was the only option available. There were children born in those tunnels who did not see sunlight for the first 2 or 3 years of their lives. Their first experiences of the world, the period when human development is most rapid, when the brain is building its fundamental models of reality, happened in near total darkness, in tight spaces, in a world of whispers and careful movement. Survivors who were born underground, or who entered the tunnels as very young children, describe a specific relationship with open space that stayed with them for decades. The sky, encountered again after years underground, felt wrong, too large, too exposed, too much like a threat. The skin conditions that developed across the underground community were widespread and difficult to treat. Persistent moisture, combined with complete absence of sunlight, created conditions for fungal infections that spread quickly through close living populations, with no effective treatment available. People spent years with chronic skin problems that caused constant discomfort. The smell in the occupied sections of the tunnel, which survivors describe with remarkable consistency, was a specific combination of damp earth, unwashed bodies, oil smoke, and something else beneath all of it, something mineral, something that belonged to the earth itself and had saturated everything in contact with it. And yet, inside those tunnels, people fell in love. Weddings happened. Not elaborate ones, not the kind with flowers and music and a feast. 2 people, their community gathered in a carved-out chamber, a commitment made without ceremony, but not without meaning. The oral histories are full of these quiet, compressed versions of ordinary human events. Birthdays acknowledged underground, deaths mourned in whispers, small celebrations marked as carefully as circumstances allowed. There were schools. Children sat in lamplit chambers and learned to read. They did arithmetic. They studied history, the history of their country, the reasons for what was happening above their heads, what had happened before, and what people were hoping would come after. The teachers who ran these underground schools were, by any measure, doing something remarkable, maintaining the scaffolding of an educated future generation in conditions where the present was radically uncertain. There were also, in the accounts of survivors, small cultural events, stories told in the dark, songs sung quietly enough that the sound stayed within the chamber walls, poetry recited from memory because books were heavy and paper deteriorated in the moisture. These were not entertainment, they were something more necessary than that. A deliberate maintenance of the things that made these people who they were, beyond the conflict, beyond the fear, beyond the hunger and the darkness. The decision to maintain culture in those tunnels was a conscious one. The people living there understood that they were not just trying to survive physically, they were trying to survive as themselves. At some point in 1966, the American military came to a conclusion that had been resisted for some time. The tunnel network could not be dealt with from above. It could not be bombed into submission. It could not be gassed, flooded, or burned out. If anyone was going to understand what was inside those tunnels and do anything about it, someone was going to have to go in. The men who volunteered for this were called tunnel rats, not by command, by everyone around them, by themselves. The name was not ironic, and it was not chosen carelessly. It reflected something honest about what the role required, not the upright, visible courage of conventional soldiering, something lower, closer to the ground, requiring a different set of instincts entirely. The selection was partly physical. Tunnel rats had to be small. The passages were designed for Vietnamese bodies, and the larger American soldiers, even ones willing to try, simply could not move through them. The men who could do this work were the ones who had always been the smallest in the room. Suddenly, the physical characteristic that had put them at a disadvantage their entire military career was the only thing that made them useful for this particular mission. The equipment was minimal by design, not by oversight. A pistol, a flashlight, though many tunnel rats stopped using the flashlight after their first few missions, because the light made them visible before it made the tunnel visible. A knife, sometimes a short stick to probe ahead in the dark. No radio. Radios didn't work reliably underground, and the noise was a liability. No communication with the surface once the trapdoor closed. Going in meant going in alone, or in a small pair, and being entirely on your own until you came back out. The training that American soldiers received for conventional combat, for open field engagements, for urban warfare, for the many environments the military had studied and prepared protocols for, provided almost no useful preparation for the tunnels. The tunnel environment was different in kind, not just degree. The closest existing framework was what some of the tunnel rats described as hunting, moving slowly through an enclosed space, in near total darkness, using hearing and touch rather than sight, trying to determine whether something in the darkness ahead was alive. The distances involved in any potential confrontation were absurd by normal military standards. A tunnel passage in the Ku Chi system was typically not much wider than a human body. In the narrowest sections, the only possible movement was pulling forward on the elbows, body flat against the floor. In those sections, if you encountered someone coming the other way, there was no room to maneuver, no space to raise a weapon in any conventional sense. The confrontation, if it came, happened at a distance measured in the length of an arm. The psychological challenge was specific and severe. In open combat, the stress produces a coherent response. The body goes into a mode that evolution has been refining for millions of years. There is a target, there is movement, there is information. In the tunnels, none of that applied. The stress was total, directionless, and unresolvable. You could not know where the threat was until it was upon you. You could not move fast enough to change that. You could only move slowly, breathe slowly, and keep going. There was a piece of knowledge passed between tunnel rats informally, never written into any training manual. When you see light ahead in a tunnel, do not move toward it immediately. Wait, because light means an opening, and an opening means someone might be waiting on the other side. The psychiatric records from the period show rates of sleep disturbance, anxiety disorders, and acute stress responses among tunnel rats significantly higher than other combat roles. Men who completed multiple missions describe a specific kind of exhaustion, not physical, though the physical toll was real, but a wearing down of the capacity to hold uncertainty without releasing it. The part of the mind that normally resolves tension was kept at maximum stretch for hours at a time in total darkness with nowhere to direct the energy. Some recovered, some did not. Every one of them, in every recorded account, describes the same thing when asked what stayed with them longest after the war. Not what they saw, not what happened, what they heard, the sound of breathing that was not their own, very close, in the dark, and the knowledge that whoever was breathing was also listening for them. By 1965, American military commanders had a clear picture of what the Cu Chi tunnel network was and what it was capable of. It was directing operations across a wide area. It was resupplying fighters in the field. It was functioning as a permanent, self-sustaining infrastructure that was growing more complex, not less, despite everything that had been thrown at it. The response was escalation, sustained, intensive, and in terms of sheer explosive tonnage, almost without historical precedent for a target of this size. The Cu Chi district received more bombs per square kilometer than any comparable area of the Vietnam War. Some analyses place it among the most heavily bombed zones in modern military history. The red clay of the region was struck, restruck, and struck again until the landscape above ground became a continuous sequence of overlapping craters, some of them large enough to hold a house, filled with stagnant water, stripped of every tree and every trace of vegetation. From the air, in photographs taken during peak operations, the ground in the Cu Chi district looks not like Earth, but like the surface of the moon. Operation Cedar Falls launched in January 1967. Approximately 30,000 American and Allied troops moved through the region in a comprehensive sweep intended to be, finally, definitive. Every structure above ground was destroyed. Supply lines identified from aerial photography were cut. The area was declared a free fire zone, meaning that anything visible on the surface was a legitimate target, without restriction. The operation found almost nothing. The people and the infrastructure they were looking for were not on the surface. They were 10 meters below it. As troops moved through the jungle above, the community below moved through their tunnels. Passages that led to the surface were sealed from inside. The real network, deeper, more extensive, and more deliberately structured than any intelligence assessment had accurately predicted, continued to function. The bombing created its own specific category of suffering underground. A large bomb detonating near the surface sends a shock wave through the earth. The curved walls and deep clay of the Cu Chi tunnels distributed this force, which is why the structures held, but the physical effect on the human bodies inside was severe. Eardrums were damaged, sometimes permanently, by the pressure changes. Blood vessels near the surface broke. People close to the point of impact experienced internal bleeding, and the experience of being underground during a heavy bombing run, the earth becoming something liquid and continuous and without direction, shaking from every side at once, was one that survivors describe with a physical specificity that doesn't diminish with time. Chemical agents were introduced into tunnel entrances, tear gas, smoke, experimental compounds. The ventilation design that normally circulated fresh air through the termite mound vents was closed from inside, sealing the community in a static atmosphere until the chemicals dispersed. People went without fresh air rather than let the gas in. The oxygen levels dropped. People sat in the dark and breathed slowly and waited. Water was pumped in from the Saigon River through hoses inserted into tunnel entrances. The tunnel system had been designed with flooding in mind. Certain sections incorporated barriers, sealed passages that could stop water from reaching the occupied levels. Flooding that entered the outer tunnels pooled in areas that had been built to receive it. None of it worked. Not because the methods were poorly executed, In most cases, they were executed with full commitment and substantial resources. But because the tunnel system had been designed by people who had thought carefully about exactly these scenarios, every method of attack had been considered in advance. Every response had been built into the structure. The people below ground stayed, not because leaving was impossible, because leaving was unacceptable. The land above them had been their family's land for generations. The fact that it was now craters and poisoned soil made no difference to that. If anything, it deepened it. What had been done to the surface of the land was visible proof of what was at stake. The earth held them, and they held the earth. There is a category of account from Cu Chi that doesn't fit the official record. It doesn't appear in military reports. It surfaces in personal testimony, interviews, memoirs, accounts gathered by historians years after the war. Consistent enough and specific enough that setting it aside feels dishonest. Start with the dogs. American tracker dogs were reliable tools in Vietnam. In most areas, they performed exactly as trained. In the Cu Chi district, handlers from multiple independent units reported the same pattern. Dogs that worked effectively elsewhere would approach certain zones, stop, and refuse to continue. Not slow, stop. The handlers described their animals as distressed in ways that had no visible cause. The scent masking of the entrances explains part of this. But the behavior occurred in specific zones, not uniformly across the area. Those zones, mapped against post-war surveys, correspond to the deepest and most densely occupied tunnel sections. Then there are the tunnel rats. One veteran, in multiple recorded interviews across different years, describes following a faint light source through a tunnel passage. It moved ahead of him at a steady pace. When he stopped, it stopped. When he turned back, it moved behind him. He came out of the tunnel. The light did not. He said it was oxygen deprivation. Low oxygen causes visual disturbances. That is the rational explanation. He offered it himself. But he also noted, decades later, that every other perception he had during that time seemed accurate. There is also a documented engineering anomaly. Thermal imaging deployed in the later stages of the war should have detected the body heat of thousands of people in a concentrated area. The readings from Cu Chi did not match the population. Post-war analysis found that the specific mineral composition of the red clay, its iron content, its moisture level, its layered structure, created a thermal buffering effect unique to this district. The earth itself was harder to see through here than anywhere else. Not metaphor, geology. Today, visitors to the tunnel site report a specific sensation at certain points inside the accessible passages. A sudden tightening in the chest, a difficulty drawing a full breath, distinct from claustrophobia, that passes when they move through. It occurs at the same locations consistently. Site management attributes it to carbon dioxide variation in low points of the passage. That is probably correct. The accounts continue anyway. Same locations, same sensation. And those locations, on the historical maps, mark the areas of heaviest and longest human occupation. The question historians keep returning to is not a military one. It is this: how did people keep functioning? Not just survive, function. Maintain schools, clinics, culture, over years, in conditions that most frameworks for human endurance would predict as unsustainable. The physical adaptations were real. People who lived underground long enough developed a sensitivity to vibration that went well beyond normal range. Survivors describe identifying aircraft types from the quality of tremors felt through Earth before any sound reached them. They could read the difference between a distant strike and one approaching. The body, given enough time and necessity, calibrates to extract information from the edge of what is perceivable. But physical adaptation was not what held the community together across years. Community was. In normal life, social bonds have room to breathe. You can withdraw, take space, manage exposure to the people around you. In the tunnels, that was impossible. The same people were there every hour of every day. No privacy, no reset, no exit. This produced friction. The oral histories are honest about that. But the dominant pattern in survivor testimony is something else. A deepening, a quality of mutual knowledge that went past the social surface. They knew each other's fear responses in the dark. They knew who would hold and who needed holding and exactly when. Decisions were collective because individual decisions affected everyone. One noise at the wrong moment involved everyone. When someone's fear became unmanageable, the community absorbed it. There was also a spiritual framework many residents maintained actively. The relationship between the living and their ancestors, a central element of traditional Vietnamese belief, was understood as functional, not symbolic. The earth they were living inside was the same earth where their ancestors had been buried. Rituals performed underground were not comfort, they were communication. They located individual suffering inside a larger story, one in which the endurance had meaning beyond survival. And finally, the choice. The people of Cu Chi had not been assigned to the tunnels, they had built them. They had chosen them. That distinction matters. To have chosen the difficult path changes the experience of that path. The difficulty becomes evidence of commitment rather than helplessness. The endurance is an act of agency, not the absence of it. They were there because they had decided to be there, and that decision held. When the war ended, the surface of Cu Chi was almost unrecognizable. The forest was gone, not reduced, gone. What remained was a sequence of overlapping craters, some 30 meters across, filled with standing water. Soil toxicity surveys in the early 1980s found contamination levels that made conventional agriculture impossible across large sections of the district. For years, almost nothing grew there. Below the surface, the tunnel network was mostly intact. Post-war surveys revealed a system more extensive than any wartime intelligence had accurately described. Sealed sections, passages blocked during the conflict when a breach occurred, had not been entered since. When they were opened, the stable underground environment had preserved their contents almost perfectly. Documents, medical equipment, personal items, weapons, the daily record of community life, held in clay and paper, had survived the war better than most of what stood above ground. The documentation revised the historical understanding significantly. There were more levels than previously known. Communication systems more sophisticated than anyone outside had suspected. Administrative records, inventories, schedules, meeting notes, showing a degree of organized self-governance that surprised the researchers who found them. The human cost was enormous and imprecise. Communities that had numbered in the hundreds were reduced to dozens. Family networks were severed across generations. Because different tunnel sections housed different groups with limited communication between them, some people did not learn what had happened to relatives in other parts of the network until months after the war ended. The survivors who emerged faced a specific challenge that civilian society was not prepared to address. The physical aftereffects, skin conditions, hearing damage, light sensitivity, were manageable over time. The relationship with space was harder. After years in passages where the walls were centimeters away, open rooms felt wrong. Open sky felt like exposure. Many survivors arranged their post-war living spaces to be smaller, more enclosed. Not from preference, from a physical instinct that did not respond to rational argument. Some worked through it within a few years. Others kept it for the rest of their lives. The land recovered slowly, decades of replanting and soil treatment. Today, the Cu Chi area is green again. Not the same forest, but living ground. And within it, preserved and open to visitors, is a section of the original tunnels. The clay walls are real. The shape is original. The darkness, when you stop and let it settle, is the same darkness 10,000 people lived inside for years. The Cu Chi tunnels are usually presented as a military story, and they are one, studied in academies on every continent. a case of asymmetric warfare that professional strategists have not finished analyzing. But that framing captures only part of it. The people who built the tunnel network had almost nothing: earth, hands, knowledge of the land, each other. No machinery, no industrial capacity. From those materials, they built something that outlasted 20 years of the most intensive bombardment ever directed at a comparable area. The constraint was total. The response to total constraint was not diminished effort. It was the opposite. Ingenuity of the kind that abundance rarely produces, because abundance rarely requires it. The Huang Kum kitchen dispersed cooking smoke through the earth invisibly. The termite mound vents hid thousands of people's breathing in plain sight. The three-level design absorbed and redistributed blast force from bombs dropped directly above. None of these came from a well-resourced engineering department. They came from people who had nothing else and needed everything. The second thing, belonging to a place. The people of Cu Chi stayed because the land was theirs in a way that went past ownership. It was their family's history, the ground where their ancestors were buried, the sum of everything that had made them who they were. Leaving was not a strategic option they rejected. It was a personal one they could not accept. That belonging was the source of the greatest suffering in this story and the greatest strength in it. The two things cannot be separated. The third thing, the limits of force. The calculation made by planners was straightforward. Enough force, applied comprehensively, will displace or destroy any population. What the calculation could not measure was the decision, made freely, with full knowledge of the cost, to stay. That decision does not appear on a thermal scan. It cannot be targeted. It turned out to be the decisive variable. And the last thing, the schools underground, the weddings in carved chambers, the poems recited from memory, the music played quietly enough to stay within the walls. These were not morale management. They were necessity. The people in those tunnels understood that surviving without remaining themselves was not the goal. The goal was to come through this as the people they were. They went underground. They held it for 20 years. They came back up, and the land was still theirs.